You already took care of it. Thanks, Jackie.
Okay, so I got this meeting that's starting. So are you going to?
So welcome everyone to this Division 16 webinar entitled The School Psychologist Primer to Race-Based Stressors. It's great. I just got muted by accident. It's really nice to have you all here today. And then thank you, Dr. Grant, for being here and giving this wonderful presentation to all of us. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. The first is if you've signed up to receive a CEU for this presentation, there will be an evaluation form link kind of shared at the end of the presentation. So please do click on that and complete the evaluation. And then you will receive your CEU within 48 hours. And then just a quick plug-in for our next webinar entitled Supporting Learner Outcomes by Improving Fidelity. And there's a QR link on this presentation as well if you want to access it directly through there. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Geremy Grant, who is an assistant professor of school psychology at Alfred University. He has 2 master's degrees in school psychology and educational psychology and a doctorate in school psychology, and all of his degrees are from the Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Grant completed a clinical postdoctoral fellowship at Middlesex Health, Connecticut's first member of the Mayo Clinic Care Network. He also served as a clinical assessment expert at Riverside Insights, a renowned publisher of psychological and educational assessments, and he has a passion for social justice and desires to bridge racial, ethnic, and cultural gaps in education to ensure equitable outcomes for all students. So before I hand things over to Dr. Grant, I just wanted to let you know to please type any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation, so I will ask them on your behalf. And if there's any questions that we don't end up getting to within the time that we have, Dr. Grant can still respond to them after the session, and then we can send his responses in an email so you still have your questions answered. So thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Grant.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that very warm welcome. And thank you, everyone, for making some time this afternoon to join us and talk about this very important conversation related to race-based stressors for our students of color. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me one moment to do that. Okay, perfect. So hopefully you all can see my content here. And okay, cool. Lindsay's giving me that thumbs up. So thank you very much for that. So yes, so I'm an assistant professor of school psychology at Alfred University. I'm going into kind of like the second half of my second year. So I'm finishing up my 3rd semester. And a lot of my kind of research focus relates around how can we make school environments more inclusive for students of color? How can we kind of think about the stressors that students of color are facing, not just within the school system, but also within the general society? And how does that kind of trickle down to the trauma that they experience just in their day-to-day lives that we still need to address as school-based staff? So I think this talk is one that is very near and dear to me, and I'm hopeful that this serves as a helpful kind of primer and foundation for us when we think about the kind of social justice work that I think NASP and APA really wants us to engage in as school psychologists and as psychologists. I was talking to the coordinators of this webinar before. Alfred University is in a very rural area. I like to say we have more farm animals than actual people. So you will see my face disappear as I present, just because I want to preserve bandwidth and not lose internet connectivity as we go through the content today. but feel free to leave your questions in the chat because I'll also try to manage the chat as best I can as we go through. All right, so these are our objectives for today. You'll notice that there's a lot of content when we think about these objectives. So kind of thinking about some of the core issues that relate to racial trauma and racial stress for our students. The common ones that I think lend themselves very well to practice are concepts like stereotype threat, microaggressions, and racial battle fatigue. So those are the three concepts that I'm going to be talking about in some detail today. I'll be providing you with some strategies that you can use to address stereotype threat in your practice, microaggressions as well, in addition to racial battle fatigue. And there's also some resources that will be provided to you. So that way, if you're consulting with teachers or parents, you're able to figure out how to address some of those sources of stress that the students and families are facing. I really think it's important for us as school staff to take on that onus because we don't want to add an additional burden to the plates of students and families of color who are already traumatized and dealing with so much stress, right? So that's kind of the broad objective for today. And without further ado, I will jump in. So I really think about talks like this and what they're motivated by. And I think about how there's a rapidly increasing majority of children that we have in families that are members of culturally and linguistically diverse groups, right? And we're noticing that within a few decades, those that are considered minoritized, at least in terms of the amount of individuals within a space, we're going to see some of that demographic shift. And with those increasing numbers, it's really paramount that we as practitioners really start to understand how to work with students from other cultural and linguistic backgrounds, right? And we also see that there's that push from our governing bodies as well. So APA and NASP, they're really emphasizing that we need to employ a multicultural approach if we're really trying to create equitable conditions for all the students that we're serving. Now, despite that push, though, from our governing bodies, from a lot of the other organizations that talk about culturally responsive practices, we still see that there's quite a bit of hate in schools. And the link that I have on this slide from the Southern Poverty Law Center, if you haven't reviewed this report, I strongly encourage you to, if this sort of work is interesting to you or of meaning to you, because they did a report on hate and bias within schools, surveying educators. And what they found was racism was identified as the predominant motivator of hate and bias, right? So kind of that was the major system of oppression that was most identified when educators were asked to talk about incidences of hate and incidences of bias within school systems. And problematically, we see a lot of that hate and a lot of that bias going unaddressed by the individuals within the school system who have the authority and the ability to enforce policies and to enforce change. So we're seeing a lot of those administrators either failing to condemn that bias, or if they condemn the bias, they're not doing the flip side. They're not thinking about how to create a space that reaffirms the students of color. So again, there's more details on top of this, but I thought these 2 points were important just to frame why conversations like this are very important. Now, whenever I talk about these topics related to race-related stress, I really want to make it clear that when we talk about racism, I'm not just talking about the old-fashioned covert racism that might be more of the hate crime or jarring acts that kind of shake entire districts. I'm also talking about some of that aversive racism, some of that more contemporary racism that's a bit more subtle, indirect, and unconscious, that really is insidious and is woven into a lot of the interactions that our students have and that our families have with members of the school community, right? So if you all have any familiarity with aversive racism, you likely would have heard that it's this unconscious racism that occurs when individuals hold these negative attitudes towards people of different races. But then at the same time, they still have some conscious beliefs and values where they'll say that they believe in equality or that they believe in fairness. So they're kind of saying that, but some of their attitudes, some of their behaviors run counter to some of those statements that they make regarding equality and fairness. So for example, we might see someone who says that they believe in racial equality, but they take a lot of time to make sure that they don't interact with people of certain backgrounds, right? or they experience so much discomfort around people of certain backgrounds, so they avoid working on that discomfort and they avoid trying to truly understand people of other races. So really one of the main issues related to this aversive racism is that it's very closely tied to the stereotypical thinking and the implicit biases that we're socialized to kind of hold within American society. And that's another reason why I bring this up, where we have a lot of unlearning to do as school staff and as practitioners related to aversive racism if we are truly trying to support our students and families of color. Now, moving to our first concept, if we're thinking about what aversive racism might look like on the day-to-day, we can think about microaggressions as a manifestation of aversive racism, right? And I think we all have heard microaggressions at some point. I think it's a very popularized term within social media, within even news media. And when you think about what a microaggression is, originally Chester Pierce, a psychiatrist, was someone who talked about microaggressions as a way to exemplify the everyday racism that people of color experience in America. And although we're certainly going to focus on the racial microaggression piece today, it's really just important to keep in mind that any marginalized and oppressed identity group can be subjected to microaggressions. So there's plenty of literature out there that talks about microaggressive themes related to someone's gender identity, sexuality, religious affiliation, and so forth. So I just wanted to make that clear as well, that even though we're focusing on race today, there's certainly other types of microaggressions that you need to be mindful of if you're working with students who are minoritized based on some identity dimension. Now, there are some additional characteristics of microaggressions that I wanted to call out. And Williams, who is a diversity researcher, they've done a lot of great work with respect to microaggressions. And some of the points that they highlight in this cited paper, I just wanted to make sure we all were aware of this as well. So I know I had mentioned before that like aversive racism is related to our implicit bias. And then in fact, microaggressions would be related to our implicit bias. That's true. But racial microaggressions are also correlated with a lot more than just implicit bias. It's also correlated with other markers of racism. So thinking about colorblind racism, thinking about that general lack of positive regard that we're socialized to have when we're thinking about people of color. So that has implications for training. If you are a school psychologist doing training related to microaggressions and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to have these individuals kind of self-reflect and explore some of the implicit biases that they might have, that's only one dimension of why someone might present a microaggression. So if we're only addressing that in our training, we're losing out on some of those other markers of racism that also relate to microaggressions. So I think that's important to call out. I think it's also important to consider that a microaggression does damage to the school climate and the school ecosystem, regardless of the victim's perception. So let's say, for example, there's a racial microaggression that is transmitted, and it's transmitted in the absence of a racially minoritized individual, right? That still does damage to that school system because it's reinforcing that power difference between the white majority and people of color that already exists within our general society, and becomes even more problematic if school staff and school administration condone the behavior or reinforce the behavior, kind of making it like that behavior is okay. That's when those microaggressions become even more problematic. And then lastly, I think we know this from the literature, but I think some of the examples can help make it more palatable or kind of salient in terms of how impactful these microaggressions are. Although micro is in the name, Sue, who is one of the individuals that does a lot of research in this area, he describes it as a death by 1,000 cuts. And similarly to that, other researchers have described the cumulative impact that these microaggressions can have on a person's functioning that really puts a real wear and tear on the children that we're working with. So you can see some of the examples that I have listed there. So they're related to things like mental health detriment, including suicidal ideation. We're thinking about challenges related to academic achievement. And then that cumulative impact that I kind of mentioned just now, that is coined as racial battle fatigue. So kind of that ongoing exposure to racial trauma and racial stress. I'll talk about that a little bit more once I get to the concept in later slides, but that is a kind of condition or syndrome that I think a lot of us should know about and should be aware of. And I'll explain why once I get to that slide. Now, when we're thinking about racial microaggressions in schools, it's important to realize that they're also connected to other forms of microaggressions, to being the nativist and immigrant origin. So the researchers cited here, they talk about how the nativist microaggressions, which when we think about what those are, they're the microaggressions that reinforce this idea of like who's a true American, and whoever has that true Americanness has the inherent right to kind of dominate the non-native. That true American has the right to those unearned privileges. That nativist kind of thinking is nested underneath a broader kind of framework related to racism. And we also have under that broader framework of racism, this immigrant origin kind of thinking. So thinking about those microaggressions that convey the idea to the individual that no matter how hard you try to assimilate to the dominant culture, your right to belong is always going to be questioned. So this relates back to that concept of a perpetual foreigner, for example, that no matter how hard you try to assimilate and engage in quote unquote American practices, you are still going to be deemed non-American. So then what are some examples? Because I think sometimes having the examples can make these constructs a bit more realistic and concrete for folks. So here are just a few from the citations that I have listed on this slide. So we see number one, forcing a multiracial student to select one race when they're taking a standardized test. So maybe that student is filling out a demographics form, and a teacher, for example, might tell the student, well, we don't have multiracial in this form, so you have to fill out Black. And maybe because phenotypically that student has a darker skin tone. What that first microaggression does is that forces that student to align with preset racial categories. And mind you, those are preset racial categories that are dictated by the white majority, because the white majority is what dictates the racial stratification within our society. And what that microaggression does is that basically says you're not allowed to express or represent your true perceptions of your identity within the school system. That's a lot of damage that can do to that student. I'll go through a couple of other examples. So like number two, for example, we might see some tokenism. So administration may be requesting that the only students of color, if there are few within the school system, that they be used in promotional materials. Now, what does that do? That could give off the air of being inclusive to folks that are thinking about going into that school system. But that can be problematic because what it does is it treats those students of color as only having value only because of what their background brings to benefit the school. And although the school might appear to be inclusive on the outside, that doesn't mean that the school provides a safe climate and social belonging for those students of color. So that's an important kind of dynamic to think about there. And then the other one that I'll talk about on this slide, because I think the assumptions of intelligence is pretty concrete. And some of us may have seen this sort of microaggression play out in our work in schools. I think number four is really important to talk about. This idea where the microaggression doesn't have to be a one-to-one interaction or a direct social interaction between two parties, that in this case, it can actually be the space that you are existing in that's constructed in a way that's microaggressive towards a minoritized group, right? So thinking about how if the curriculum lacks representation of your background, so you don't see any text related to your cultural background, you don't see any, thinking about younger children, any toys that have a skin complexion that is similar to your own. Kind of thinking about some of that curricular hegemony in a sense. And I think it's also important to think about how sometimes schools will say, well, we have representation in the curriculum, but then what's the quality of that representation in the curriculum? Is it positive or is it negative? Is it that the student has some representation, but it's representation that reinforces stereotypical thinking related to their background? If it is the latter in that way, that's something that we would want to address and take care of as school psychologists, kind of explaining the implications of that harmful curriculum on the student of color's academic success and on their mental health as well. Okay, so I kind of just hinted when I talked about the curriculum as being threatening, as being aggressive. That's a representation of an environmental microaggression. So thinking about that idea where those spaces, again, can invalidate that lived experience of people of color. And that invalidation can be, as I mentioned, through a reinforcement of stereotypical thinking related to people of color, or it could be the invalidation where you're not even included in the curriculum. So it's almost like your existence isn't worth mentioning. To flip to another type of stressor that I think is important to think about are macro stressors, or you can think about them maybe as macroaggressions. So these large scale kind of systems related stressors, maybe thinking about televised police brutality, where a lot of our students likely have access to social media, to news media, where they're exposed to seeing, a member of my group being treated in a very detrimental manner, and how that can contribute to their feelings of stress and feelings of trauma, even if they're not the direct victim of that incident. So I think what this gets at is kind of us thinking about what's going on in the broader society and how can that be affecting the minoritized students that we work with. Okay, so I talked a bit about microaggressions so far, and I think that it's important to then talk about racial battle fatigue. So I briefly had mentioned how this is that cumulative result that's a natural kind of response to racial trauma and racial stress that you experience day to day. And Smith, who's cited on the slide, he is the originator of this construct, and he describes how that prolonged exposure to those microaggressions and those macroaggressions, they result in very distinct physiological, behavioral, and psychological outcomes for students of color, right? So let me give you some examples of those. So we're thinking about psychological, the research has shown things like frustration, shock, and anger, if we're thinking about short-term reactions to chronic racial stress, and then more longer-term conditions like generalized anxiety, for example. When we think about physiological responses, we might think about things like high blood pressure, sleep disturbances, fatigue. And then behavioral, we might see a student demonstrate social withdrawal, neglecting responsibility, maybe poor school performance. But I think you're starting to get the idea that it's not only affecting a student in these separate domains, but within the domain, the presentation can be so varied in terms of the symptoms or features that the person's presenting with. So it has a very broad impact on a person of color's functioning. And I think the significance of racial battle fatigue is if it's left unchecked, when you start to look at some of these symptoms, if a person doesn't receive the support they need to counteract some of that racial trauma, it certainly could slowly kill that individual. So kind of think about how that fatigue could slowly kill the students and families of color that we're working with. Towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to introduce the concept of radical healing and just talk about some ways in which school systems might be able to promote some of that, and how they can engage in some educational reform that can hopefully make at least the school environment a place that doesn't contribute to this fatigue that I'm talking about right now. Okay, so I think talking about microaggressions, talking about racial battle fatigue, talking about that day-to-day stress that people face, I think it's really important to highlight the concept of racial microaffirmations, or just microaffirmations in general. And I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with the concept, but if we think about microaggressions as being those acts of racism that tear down a student of color, then microaffirmations are those small acknowledgements that we make that help to kind of affirm that person's value, their belonging, and their accomplishments within the school system. And I think that all members of the school community, not just us as school psychologists, need to be knowledgeable about what microaffirmations are. And I'll provide you all some examples of what they are after I go through this taxonomy that Roland Dow and Davidson made. So they classify microaffirmations as falling within 4 distinct categories. So you'll see on the screen now microvalidations. And what those do, those are kind of acts, behaviors, or messages that help that student of color understand that their race is accepted or legitimized or given some sort of value within the school system. We then have micro-recognitions, and when we think about micro-recognitions, what those do is they help that student of color feel as if their background is worth being acknowledged, that their background is visible to the school community, and that they actually are being included inside the school community. The next that we have is micro-transformations, and I think that these are important too. So a micro transformation, if you think about what that word transformation means, it's kind of like change. So it's kind of talking about how a system, so think about a school system, is engaged in processes to further integrate that student of color into the school system. So what changes is the school making to enhance that student of color's ability to succeed academically, socio-emotionally? What changes is the school system making to implement more positive cultural elements about that student of color's background? All of those small changes that a school might be engaging in are ways in which the school is transforming itself to be more aligned with the needs of students of color, which is where that transformation part of this term comes into play. And then lastly, we have micro protections. So kind of thinking about those things that help to protect or shield the students of color from that racial hate and racial bias that they experience day in and day out. So this might be actions from allies. So maybe a school staff member stepping in to intervene if there's an instance of bias, but it could also be on a broader scale. So thinking about the school implementing particular policies and rules that help to ensure that this discrimination and bias doesn't get perpetuated within its system. Now, when we think about some of the benefits of microaffirmations, the literature talks about how when we start to use microaffirmations in an appropriate way and in a consistent way, it can help us almost block the presentation of microaggressions. And I like to kind of think about it this way, where if we're going with the intention of affirming someone, and we get into the habit of affirming someone's identity and including someone's identity, that can help us to replace the habit of thinking stereotypically with thinking inclusively. And I think that's what the literature is getting at here. The more we practice these microaffirmations, the more that they can start to spread, not just from us working with that one student, but if an observer sees us affirm a student of color, that then models for them how they might be able to do it with the students that they work with, and so on. So it's kind of like a chain reaction in that point. They're also considered remedies of care that heal individuals, right? So kind of that idea where if leaders within a school space can embody and enforce those practices that bring about inclusivity, that bring about equity for students of color, then that can help to further protect them from the various forms of victimization that they face within society. And then lastly, and I think this makes a lot of sense, if we're affirming someone's identity, if we're trying to support them regularly, what that's going to do is foster a more positive identity. It's going to foster their resilience, because part of those microaffirmations is really helping to show that student that there is a counter narrative to the story that they've been kind of living day in and day out as a person of color, that their experience won't always be one that is marked by racism, that there are opportunities and hope for an equitable society. So to make it a bit more concrete, these are some examples from the literature, and I'll go back for a moment. The references that I have listed here, and also thinking about Roland Dow as well. A lot of the work on microaffirmations will have some examples that can give you an idea of what it looks like. But these are just some that I pulled out of the literature just to make it more concrete for you. So I think looking through, some of these pieces might be things we already do. So actively listening to students, maybe showing a genuine interest in their academic success. But I think where sometimes we notice some issues when it comes to that day-to-day bias and oppression that students face are looking at numbers 2 and looking at number 5. So thinking about trusting students when they say their identity has been targeted. I think oftentimes we might see individuals who will question whether or not that targeting really happened. And that's one of the things that we don't want to do. We don't want to invalidate someone's lived experience, because we're not in their shoes and we can never be in their shoes. So how do we have the place to say that they did not experience what they think they experienced, right? So we want to trust those students when they say their identity has been targeted, so we don't commit further harm. But then I think it's also important to think about, how are we going to create a space that acknowledges that these students are there, that they are present? And then how do we create a space that also highlights the positive contributions of their background, knowing that so many racially and ethnically minoritized youth get a lot of negative messages about their background on the daily. Okay, so as I go through and talk about racial bias and microaggressions, I think it's also important just to highlight, what do practitioners need to do if they commit a microaggression themselves? Because I think, especially if we're believing that we're working towards cultural competence and that we are agents of social justice, we might feel as if, it's very disingenuous if we do engage in a microaggression. And I want to say that we all have the capacity to commit one, and that we likely have committed multiple in the past. And we may not know it, but we likely have committed multiple in the past just because of the way that we are socialized and trained to think as a part of US society. So I think some of the more important elements to think about here is that if a student talks to us about feeling harmed by something that we've said, we want to listen without being defensive, right? We don't want to deny that they feel hurt or feel offended. And we also need to think about how that student is the expert when it comes to their lived experience. So we need to allow them to use that voice and try to advocate for themselves. We want to acknowledge any harm that we may have caused. We need to genuinely apologize. And that genuinely apologize piece is very important, because coming across as being sarcastic in the apology or coming across as not really meaning the apology when you present it, that can further cause harm for that student. And then we also want to explain what actions we're going to take to learn from the interaction. So like, how are we going to remediate our behavior? It's not enough to just say, I'm genuinely sorry for the harm I've caused, but also how am I going to take this experience and learn from it to make sure that this doesn't happen again in the future? I think that's really huge. And it shows that individual victim that you are trying to be proactive now moving forward to make sure that this instance is minimized. I might be thinking, how in the world am I supposed to maybe even respond to a microaggression if I see one? Because that's something that also can be hard for school staff and a lot of folks. And in the literature, there are a few different approaches that you can think about. One that I really like that's very structured is the OWTFD approach by Soto Santiago and others. And it has these 5 elements in it. And I have a scenario that I'll present to you all just to show you how it can be used to structure a response. But you can see that it really pulls out a lot of the more objective elements that might occur during a microaggressive interaction. So you're talking about first what you observed. So you're making comments based on concrete factual observations. And then what I think is important is then you're posing what or why questions. You're providing that offender an opportunity to reflect upon the microaggression. So like, what did you mean when you said, or why did you say that? That's not necessarily placing blame on the person right in that moment, but that's giving them a chance to say, what did I mean when I actually said that? Or why did I say that? That gives them a second to kind of engage in some metacognition around why they presented what they did in the first place. Then the approach talks about offering a thought based on the observations that you made. You talk about the feelings that you might have based on those observations. And then importantly, you talk about that desired outcome. What are you trying to see happen as a result of the microaggression? So usually the person might say their desired outcome is kind of reconciliation or further learning for that individual. So I'll show an example just to make this a bit concrete. So as a bystander, let's just say that you are in a training program and you notice, maybe you're the professor, you notice that rather than asking you or your class TA, one of your students, Mary, asked her classmate, James, the only Black student, can you help me? I'm struggling with our Black history paper and I need some tips. You notice that James says in response, I'm not sure why you asked me. We have a professor that can help, right? So you've observed that. You've observed Mary asking that question of James, and you've observed James's response to Mary. Now, when we think about that underlying message to Mary's comment, we see a couple of kind of themes here. For one, she's asking the only Black student about Black history, but she's overlooking the fact that within racial groups, there's a vast difference in how a person's identity is developed, right? So there's certain individuals that hold race a lot more central to their self-concept, and there's certain individuals that might hold race a bit less central to their self-concept. So she's making some assumptions around his identity development. And then she's also making some assumptions around his knowledge of history and engagement in cultural practices as well, right? There might be a student of color who doesn't have as much knowledge related to Black history, although they might identify as Black. So in this case, we kind of can see James might feel a little frustrated, maybe a little confused, especially because she's now talking to him because she needs something. And you can see here that in the past, he's tried to collaborate with her and things really haven't worked out when he's tried to initiate. So he might feel a little bit slighted now that she's expecting support from him, even though she hasn't provided support in the past. So as a professor, I might be able to say something along those lines, especially if I've made sure with James as a part of this kind of intervention that he's comfortable with me intervening on his behalf. I might say something like this. I might go to this student and say, I overheard that you asked James for help with the Black history assignment. What made you ask James specifically rather than myself or the TA? That pause for response gives the perpetrator a chance to think about why they did what they did or why they asked what they asked. You then provide a thinking statement. I think James may not have perceived it that way. You pause, allow the person to provide their side. Then you talk about your feelings. I feel concerned for James because of what was observed. And then a desire, kind of what you want the outcome to be. Please check in with him to discuss this matter and offer an apology for this misunderstanding. So again, I like approaches like this because it at least gives you a starting point to think about how to engage in a discussion around microaggressions, which honestly can be very loaded and very challenging for a lot of individuals. And if you review Soto Santiago's paper, which is linked to this slide, she does have a lot of content related to how she ran a workshop in order to kind of help practitioners be able to address microaggressions more so in practice. And I think that workshop is one that can also be helpful for professional development. We're thinking about school staff, if we might be holding a training for them. So I do think that this is a pretty concrete approach. It's very consumable for most folks. And I think that that workshop kind of resource that's in the appendices of this paper, I think that that's very important as well if you're trying to do a PD or training on this topic. Okay. So I'm going to now talk about stereotype threat, transition into that. This is the third concept that I do think is very important when we're thinking about the race-based stressors that our students of color face. And I think many of us may have heard about this threat in some way in the past. Claude Steele is the pioneer of this threat. And for those who are not familiar with it, it's that situational threat that can affect members of different groups if those groups are affiliated with negative stereotypes. Right. And the idea here is if you are put in a position where you might confirm a negative stereotype about a particular social identity that you have, then that might bring about apprehension or concern. And that concern then can lead to detriments in your performance. Now, where I think a lot of practitioners might not have the most expertise on this concept is that stereotype threat is very varied. And I'll say that again, because that might have been a little repetitive, but there's a lot of variation in stereotype threat. So I think when we discuss it in the literature, we talk a lot about group level threat. Like, I don't want to confirm a negative stereotype about my group, but there are also other dimensions related to stereotype threat that are related to who the target of the threat is and who the source of the threat is. So in this case, you might have a child who isn't necessarily worried about confirming a stereotype about their group. Maybe they're worried that if they do not perform as well on a task, that that's going to confirm that that stereotype is true of them as an individual, not necessarily just of their group, but that it's also true of them as an individual. So that's more of a self-directed threat instead of a group-directed threat. Shapiro and Newberg are the ones that kind of conceptualize that multi-threat framework, and I have that paper linked there. I think it's really important to kind of think about how varied these threats can be, because it gives you a really good idea of the different ways in which the threat can impact someone when we're engaging in performance-related activities. When we think about the main impact, when we look at kind of systematic reviews of the literature, we can see that it may increase feelings of anxiety, negative thinking, and mind wandering. And what do all three of those things do? It depletes your working memory resources. And then what do you need in the service of learning and in the service of a lot of the assessments that we engage in with these students, those students need working memory, they need free cognitive resources, and those things are hijacked by the experience of the stereotype threat. So then how might the threat apply to schooling? I have some literature listed here that I think is really important to review for those who are not familiar with the concept. So literature has shown that it can affect an individual's cognitive functioning and demonstration of their abilities on standardized measures of performance. And I think that's really important to consider the implications of stereotype threat then when we're thinking about high stakes testing, right? Thinking about a test where a specific score cutoff determines whether or not the student has access to certain programming or access to certain opportunities. We can also think about how important the fact that stereotype threat can be elicited on standardized testing, how that relates to the work we do, right? When we think about a WJ4 or a Wechsler test, those are standardized measures, right? And literature has shown that you can certainly elicit a stereotype threat that leads to a detriment in performance on standardized testing. Within the classroom, we look at academic skill acquisition. We also can see that if the classroom is one in which a student feels threatened because of their identity, then that can actually impact their ability to encode new information and actually learn and process new content. And then what does that mean? If the student is struggling to learn content and make sense of it in the classroom, then how are they expected to demonstrate those skills at a later time on an assessment or a performance measure, right? You can't demonstrate what you didn't adequately encode and make sense of to begin with. So I think that speaks to the importance of inclusive classrooms and having them be identity safe. And I'll talk about some of those strategies in a moment. And then lastly, I think it's important as well to just think about this academic identity development piece, how chronic exposure to stereotype threat in schooling can lead to a student having a different kind of identity related to their academic achievement. And what that term is called within the literature is academic disidentification, where if somebody has been exposed to chronic threat within a particular domain, in order to avoid lower self-concept and lower self-esteem, that student might disidentify or separate how much that academic domain plays a role in terms of their own kind of self-concept and how they make sense of themselves. Now, this has a lot of implications if we think about those students who might be viewed as not caring about school or might not be seen as being motivated for school. Before someone thinks that it's an innate concern, maybe checking to see, does the student even feel safe within the classroom? And if not, then that might be part of the reason why the student is struggling with kind of connecting with academia, right? It may not be an innate or intrinsic lack of motivation. It might be a coping response to the stress that they're feeling within the academic space. Now, when we think about reducing identity threat within the classroom, Jordan and Lovett published a really good paper back in 2007 that was actually a primer for stereotype threat for school psychologists. And they talk a little bit about how you can address it within your one-to-one assessments and also how you can address it within the classroom. So when we're thinking about within the classroom, one of the things they highlighted was explaining standards, kind of explaining criteria that were going to be used to measure someone's performance as explicitly as possible. And that includes both in-class tasks and also those district and state assessments. Because the idea here is you want the criteria to be clear enough to ensure that any members of an oppressed group don't perceive that poor grades are due to their status as members of stereotyped groups in academia, right? You want a student of color who gets a poor score on a state-based literacy exam to think that that poor score was a representation of how Black children cannot engage well in literacy, right? We wouldn't want that to be the case. And furthermore, one of the other things that they talk about is how we want to make sure that students understand that a lot of these high stakes tests, the people that are engaging in the scoring, especially if it's like a third party company that's doing some of the scoring, usually those scorers don't have access to certain identifying information like race or gender or ethnicity. So that could also help them to feel less threatened, as if the scorer is going to know when they read my exam, they're going to know that I am a Black student, and then those stereotypes might affect the way that I'm scored. So making that clear could also remove some of that kind of apprehension as well. Looking at the middle column, the literature talks a lot about growth mindset interventions, talks a lot about how helping students to understand that intelligence is malleable is very much so positively associated with those students doing well in core content areas in school. And there are a lot of psychoeducational interventions that have been employed that can help students to see that their intelligence and their skill set can grow, especially if they're provided that safe environment and if they're provided proper instruction. And that psychoeducation and those interventions have been shown to help students maintain their effort and maintain adequate levels of academic achievement as well in schools. And then I think importantly, looking at the last column to the right, just thinking about identity-safe classrooms, thinking about how teachers, administrators, and us as school psychologists, we need to make sure that students feel like they're in classrooms where they don't feel limited or stigmatized because of their cultural background. And what that means is teachers, aides, paraprofessionals, whoever is working directly with the students within that classroom setting, they need to make sure that those individuals have some understanding of cultural diversity principles and also how to challenge some of those instances where bias and discrimination are kind of brought forth within the classroom. Because again, when those sort of conversations are left kind of by the wayside, then that reinforces and condones them, and it causes further harm for our students of color. Now, when we're thinking about testing, I didn't want to forget to mention this slide here. Holman and others in 2023, they provided some very great information around how we can incorporate collaborative and therapeutic techniques into our assessment process. And I think that these strategies can help us to reduce that identity threat and reduce some of that racial stress that students of color might experience when we're testing them. So I'll go through these pretty quickly so I can get to my other slides too. When we think about looking at number 1 and number 2, oftentimes we'll administer measures to students and we may not really give them a good idea of what the measure even is. And I think sometimes that can lead to a lot of ambiguity. And what does that ambiguity tend to lead to? Anxiety, right? If you're not sure why someone is using a particular measure with you, then you're not necessarily sure what the motive is. And that can lead to a lot of vigilance around, it's this school staff member, who is a school psychologist, administering this to me to reconfirm some of the stereotypical thinking that school staff already has about me or school administration already has about me. So by being transparent in why we're using particular tests, that can help the student see that we're not necessarily trying to use the testing to reinforce stereotypical thinking. Maybe we're using that testing to answer a question that they might have about themselves or that family might have about them. So here's an example. I'm testing a Black student who was referred for concerns related to ADHD and executive functioning. And what I might do is if I'm administering maybe the CPT-3, that computerized measure of sustained attention, I might explain to that student that the measure looks at their ability to focus for long periods of time, and that can help me understand why they might have some trouble focusing within the classroom. So kind of them seeing why I'm doing what I'm doing and how it connects to the concerns that they have about themselves, that pulls away some of that ambiguity. And then going along with number 2, that higher face validity. So if a family is coming in saying they have concerns about mathematics or they have concerns about working memory, kind of starting with some of those tasks to show them that the procedures you're planning to use as part of the assessment do truly align with what they're trying to understand. And then what I also think is important, Holman and others talk about how we could then engage in conversation with the student and family about how the testing that we're doing relates to the child's lived experience. So again, kind of connecting with them and building that trust around the procedures that we're using. And then the last point I think is important to highlight really quickly is looking at this idea of when the student seems disengaged, rather than coming from a judgmental stance or maybe trying to force the student to finish the testing, maybe we need to be more empathetic And maybe we need to think about pausing that administration and trying to figure out, what's going on for the student. What are you thinking right now? What are you feeling right now? And I think that's important because that pause is going to show that you care about the student. And by pausing, you can get a lot of great qualitative information around what might be causing the student to be disengaged to begin with. So those are some strategies here. There are additional strategies that you can implement kind of throughout the span of the assessment that Hallman and others speak to in their paper that's cited here. Okay, I know we only have about 8 minutes left, but I think we also started at about like 3:10, which is my time. So if any folks are able to hang after a little after I guess it would be 1 p.m. time for West Coast folks and 4 o'clock time for East Coast folks. If you're able to hang around a little while, I have a little bit of time because I definitely want to answer any questions that people have. But I'll quickly go through these slides. So really a lot of what I'm trying to convey today, and really the main point is how a lot of how we function in schools right now, I think it aligns a lot more with this idea of coping with stressors, this idea where we're really just trying to help students survive or manage the kind of consequences of racism within school, right? But I think that healing really should be what our practice focuses on. So ideas of how we can help students to thrive and recover from the oppression that they deal with on the day-to-day. Now, there's a very handy framework that was put forth in the literature by French and others back in 2020, where they talk about a radical healing framework, and it's comprised of 5 different elements, and I'll go through them briefly with some examples of how they tie into our work in schools. So they talk first about critical consciousness. So this idea where in order for you to really heal from oppression and racism, the person has to be able to critically reflect and act upon the social and political environments that they're a member of. And when I start to think about that and how that could be related to like liberating yourself from oppression, I start to then think about how can a school engender critical consciousness? Well, some examples that I thought about was schools can offer that space where students can think about and analyze social justice issues. Maybe students can have the opportunity to participate in critical action. So an example of that might be a history class working together to write a petition to a local assemblyman, maybe about an issue affecting racially minoritized youth. But the point being is schools can be a place that foster that critical thinking around oppression and liberation, rather than being places that might sweep those sort of concerns under the rug. We also have cultural authenticity and self-knowledge. So kind of thinking about this idea where the individual's culturally related strengths and supports and the environment is kind of structured in a way that really helps them to present as their true selves. So you don't have to really hide your racial background or code switch, but it also gives them a chance to like understand themselves a little bit more as cultural beings. So I think that schools can foster this component by providing students access to educational experiences that convey their cultural strengths and positive counter narratives to those stereotypes that students face from general society. I think in the environment, schools might be able to do things like set up spaces where students can see cultural specific art or listen to culturally specific music. But basically doing something within the space that brings in that person's culture so they see that their culture is acknowledged in a positive way. Then we have collectivism. I think collectivism is important as well. So this kind of like communal healing where people can be authentic with peers of a similar background and they can build community with them. I think that schools can kind of achieve this by creating things like cultural events, being able to provide affinity groups or other venues that help students share their story and really build community with others. So that way they can have solidarity. And then there's just 2 more elements, and then I'll open up for questions and answers just because I know we're getting close to the end time here. We then have radical hope. So radical hope is kind of that fuel that helps an oppressed individual think about what could the world be if oppression did not exist, right? So it helps them kind of think about a better present and a better future, despite the fact that there are ongoing social problems. And where I think schools can really make some impact here is when they start to provide students the space to kind of discuss and think about all of the progress that these race-related social movements are making. Because if students can start to see that there is some headway being made related to some of these issues, then that can help them envision the fact that there might be possibilities for race-related change moving forward, right? Because if they don't see that progress is possible, then what ends up happening is students will think that things will never change. And that leads to a lot of, dispirited children and a lot of racial battle fatigue. And then that last component I'll highlight really quickly before opening it up is just thinking about strength and resilience. I think this is very important as well. So this idea where in order to have that hope in the face of oppression, the person has to be able to have resilience and have strength. They have to be able to, I think, kind of see either historical and or contemporary figures within society who are kind of models of resistance to oppression and were kind of models of cultural strength. And I think that those individuals could serve as inspirations for future social justice work. I think some ways in which a school might be able to achieve this is connecting with community leaders who might advocate for social change, especially if those leaders are individuals of color, because that also could then provide those students of color in that school opportunities for mentorship, opportunities for additional access to resources. And then it also gives them that direct kind of experience with someone who is a source of strength and someone who is a model of resistance. Okay, I think I will open it up, I guess, here to questions. I do apologize for not getting through every single one of my slides. I only had a couple left, but I also want to understand that we only have a couple of minutes left, so folks can hang around for like 10 more minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions that they might have.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. That was a wonderful presentation. One question that we have is, can you share a little bit about how white people can serve as allies in this work?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that question because I'm talking about it almost as if, yeah, just jump up tomorrow and just go do it. And obviously the process is a lot more complicated than that. I think that when we're considering allyship, regardless of what the minoritized identity is that you're trying to support, I think the first and most foremost is critical self-reflection, kind of thinking about, especially if you're talking about racial kind of concerns, has that white individual really sat and reconciled their white privilege? Have they reconciled their own white guilt and white fragility? Have they really engaged in kind of lived experiential kind of activities with people of color? Or is a lot of their understanding from like PDs like this, which are great, but what the literature says is when you actually sit with that quote unquote other, that's when you really start to gain a new appreciation and understanding of the struggles and challenges that that group faces. So I think it's a combination of doing that honest reflection with oneself and sitting with that discomfort around like what role have I played in racism, and then also thinking about, have I really engaged in authentic interaction with this group? Because if you haven't done either one of those, then it's going to be really hard to serve as an effective ally.
Wonderful, thank you. That was very helpful. Are there any other additional resources that people can access?
Yeah, so I did email Dr. Fallon a list of like all of the references. There are some resources that I can actually call out. Let me share my screen one more time since this was a good question. I'm going to go back to some of the resources that I have embedded in here that I want to call out. So let me go here. So on this slide here, what you all see are links to some of the resources that I think are helpful for microaggressions. So I talked about that OTWFD approach. The action model is another model that you can use if you're trying to help people like structure responses to microaggressions. Then Learning for Justice, they have a lot of great literature and kind of like handouts on addressing racial bias and discrimination in schools. And the example that I have here, Speak Up at School, talks about like strategies that school staff can use if they kind of see oppression inside of a school system. Project Ready, they have built-in modules. I think they were originally made for librarians, but honestly, the content is very general. So they talk about, for example, like what is cultural competence and why does it matter in practice? what is implicit bias and how does that affect our work. So I think that the Project Ready modules are a great kind of supplement if folks are trying to engage in some self-paced learning. And then Anti-Defamation League, they also have some on-demand learning as well around kind of managing bias and discrimination in schools.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
I noticed we're just above the hour, just beyond the hour. Are there any other questions? Any final questions possibly that anybody hasn't had the chance to ask yet?
And I can also show in the slides too, just so folks know, my contact information is listed here. So my LinkedIn is there and also my email account as well. So if you have a question that comes up like the minute we end today, feel free to connect with me and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation.
Wonderful.